The moment Adelaide Winslow opened her mouth at the Harlan Creek Town meeting, every man in that sweltering hall turned to look at her as if she had just drawn a pistol and fired it at the ceiling. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the grass rolled like an amber sea, and the sky pressed down on the earth like a hot iron on muslin cloth. Harlan Creek was a town of roughly 400 souls, cattlemen and shopkeepers, schoolteachers and blacksmiths, all of them crammed into the old Pemberton Hall on a Thursday evening in late July, fanning themselves with whatever they had and arguing about water rights and railroad deals and the price of feed. The oil lamps threw orange light across the rough-hewn walls, and the smell of sawdust and sweat sat heavy in the air. Adelaide had arrived alone, the way she always arrived at things these days. 2 years had passed since Robert Winslow had died thrown from his horse on a muddy slope 3 miles from town, and in those 2 years she had learned what it meant to carry everything by herself. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned firmly beneath a simple hat, and eyes the color of a river shallows where the green and the gray could not decide which one had won. She was not a small woman, not in spirit and not in frame, and she stood straight-backed at all times the way her mother had taught her, because her mother had told her that posture was the only armor a woman could wear in public without anyone noticing. She had come to the meeting because of the creek itself. The Harlan Creek Irrigation Consortium, 4 of the wealthiest cattlemen in the county, had been quietly petitioning the county commissioner to redirect the southern branch of Harlan Creek away from the smaller homesteads and toward the consortium's own expanded grazing lands. If they succeeded, Adelaide's farm would lose its primary water source. The garden that fed her and her 7-year-old daughter Clara and the 2 farmhands she barely paid would go to dust by September. She had read the petition herself, borrowed it from the county office for a single afternoon, and she had spent 3 nights at her kitchen table writing down everything she wanted to say. She was not the only small farmer in the room. There were others: the Aldrich family, old Pete Gruber, the Hendersons with their 4 children who stood to lose just as much. But when Mayor Hargrove, a red-faced man with a brushy mustache and a voice like a barrel being rolled downhill, called for commentary from the floor, the other small farmers shifted in their boots and looked at one another and said nothing. Adelaide stood up. She had barely gotten through 2 sentences, explaining that the southern branch of the creek was the only reliable water source for no fewer than 11 homesteads, when Mayor Hargrove raised his hand. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, not unkindly but with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once in his life wondered whether his certainty was warranted, "we appreciate your concern. Now, if you would kindly take your seat, the gentlemen of the consortium have prepared a formal response to any—" "I will not sit," Adelaide said. Her voice did not shake. It surprised her, that steadiness, but she held on to it. "I have read the petition. I have letters from 7 of the affected homesteaders, and I have a calculation done by my own hand, showing that the redirection will reduce water flow to those properties by 60 to 70% during the dry months. I am asking this council to hear those numbers before it votes." A ripple went through the crowd. Some of it was admiring, much of it was uncomfortable. Wendell Beaumont, who was the largest cattle baron in the consortium, and who sat in the front row with the relaxed posture of a man who had already decided the outcome of the evening, turned in his seat and looked at her with the kind of smile that men like him kept stored for moments like these, tolerant, dismissive, faintly amused. "Mrs. Winslow," Mayor Hargrove said again, and this time there was a firmness in it that had not been there before, "I must ask you to sit down. We will take up all written concerns in due process. Please, sit." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something is about to be decided. Adelaide felt the weight of every gaze. She felt the flush rising in her throat. She had her papers in her hand, actual papers, with numbers on them, with logic and evidence, and she was being asked to fold them away as if they were a child's drawing. Then someone behind her stood up. She heard the scrape of the chair before she turned, and when she did, she saw a man she did not know rising to his full height in the fourth row. He was tall, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor labor rather than the gym, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of a well-worn but clean canvas shirt. He had a quiet face, not handsome in the showy way of the men who knew they were handsome, but the kind of face that had been shaped by paying attention to the world, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it had learned patience the hard way. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "I would like to hear more," he said. His voice was unhurried. Not loud, but it carried in that hall with an ease that suggested he was a man people had gotten used to listening to, even if that was not always his intention. Mayor Hargrove blinked. "Mr. Donnelly, the lady has calculations. She has letters. I rode through 3 of those homesteads last spring, and I can tell you that the southern branch is not supplemental water for those families. It is the water. So I would like to hear what she has to say before this council votes on something that will determine how 11 families spend the next decade." He paused. "That seems reasonable to me." Another silence. This one felt different than the first. Wendell Beaumont had stopped smiling. Adelaide Winslow looked at the man, this Levi Donnelly she had apparently never had occasion to meet, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It was something closer to recognition, the feeling of seeing someone across a room and understanding, in the vague and wordless way of such things, that you are looking at a person of consequence. "Very well," said Mayor Hargrove, after a moment that stretched long enough to make his discomfort clear. "Mrs. Winslow, you have 5 minutes." She used every one of them. When she finished, the room was quieter than it had been all evening. She laid out her numbers clearly, citing the survey she had found in the county records from 1869 that showed the exact water distribution along the southern branch. She named each of the 11 homesteads and their water dependency. She read a sentence from each of the 7 letters she had collected from neighboring farmers, and she asked the council, simply and directly, to table the vote until an independent survey could be conducted. When she sat down, Levi Donnelly caught her eye briefly and gave a single, small nod. She looked away before she could think too much about it. The vote was tabled. It was not a victory, not yet. Wendell Beaumont's expression made that clear enough as he filed out of the hall with his associates, speaking in low tones. But the vote was tabled, and that was something. Adelaide gathered her papers and stepped into the night air, which was only marginally cooler than the air inside. The stars over the panhandle were the kind that city people wrote poems about, and country people simply lived under close and brilliant and indifferent, blazing in their thousands across the dark. She had just reached the hitching post where her horse, a steady bay mare named Pearl, was waiting when she heard footsteps behind her on the wooden boardwalk. "Mrs. Winslow," she turned. It was Levi Donnelly, hat now on his head, his horse a big gray quarter horse with a calm eye tied a few posts down. "Mr. Donnelly," she said. She was not sure what to say beyond that. "You did well in there," he said. He was not flattering her. He said it the way someone stated a fact. "I'm still not certain it will hold," she admitted. "Wendell Beaumont has the commissioner's ear. He has had it for years." "That's true," Levi said. "But now it's in the open. That's harder to undo than a backroom decision." He paused, looking at the street. "I'm Levi Donnelly. I have the Donnelly Ranch north side of town, about 8 miles out. I should have introduced myself inside. Adelaide Winslow. My farm is on the Caraway Road, about 4 miles south." "Robert Winslow's place," he said, and then, with a careful quiet, "I was sorry to hear about your husband. I was traveling when it happened, came back through after the fact." "Thank you," she said. She had learned to receive condolences cleanly without letting them unravel her. "He was a good man." Levi nodded. He did not fill the silence with the usual assurances people felt compelled to offer. He simply let what she had said stand, and she appreciated that more than he could have known. "I have a thought," he said, And you can tell me plainly if it's not useful. Beaumont will come at this again. The consortium doesn't give up easily. I know that from dealing with them over grazing rights 2 years back. If you want to build a proper case before the next meeting, you'll want survey data, and you'll want it from someone who can't be bought. I know a man retired from the Army Corps, lives over in Cimarron, who does independent water surveys, straight as an arrow, and his name carries weight. Adelaide looked at him carefully. Why would you help with this? You don't have land on the southern branch. He looked at her for a moment as if the question was almost surprising. No, he said. But they do. He tilted his head slightly in the direction of the town, meaning the small farmers still filtering out of the hall. And because what Beaumont and his people are trying to do is wrong, and I have found that that's usually reason enough. She felt something in her chest settle into a steadier rhythm. I would be grateful for the introduction, she said, truly. I'll write to him tomorrow. His name is Thomas Bryce. If you're agreeable, I could ride out to your farm once I hear back. I'd like to see the land and the water situation myself if that's all right. Of course, she said. You are welcome any time. Clara and I keep reasonable hours. Clara is your daughter. She is 7 years old and she has opinions about everything. Something warm moved through his expression. Sounds like good company. Adelaide smiled, a real smile, not the polite, careful one she had learned to keep in reserve for public occasions. It had been a while since a smile felt like it belonged to her, rather than to some performance of normalcy she had been putting on for the benefit of everyone around her. She is, she said. Mostly. They said good night, and Adelaide rode home under those extraordinary stars with something new settled inside her chest, something she did not have a name for yet, and was not certain she was ready to name. The days that followed were full of the ordinary work of late July, the relentless labor of keeping a farm alive in Texas summer heat. Adelaide rose before the sun and worked beside her 2 farmhands, an older Mexican man named Esteban and his nephew Diego, who had come with the farm when Robert bought it and who had stayed out of loyalty, and she suspected, genuine fondness for the land. She pulled weeds in the kitchen garden and repaired the fence along the south pasture and helped Diego mend the pump mechanism on the well. Clara followed her everywhere, asking questions and narrating the world in the earnest, ceaseless way of 7-year-olds, and Adelaide listened with one ear even when her hands were buried in fence wire. She thought about the meeting. She thought about Wendell Beaumont's smile fading as she read out her numbers. She thought about Levi Donnelly standing up in the 4th row with his hat in his hands. A week passed before she saw him again. She was in Harlan Creek at Morrison's General Store, filling her supply order, when he came in through the door with a folded letter in his hand and something close to satisfaction on his face. Thomas Bryce wrote back, he said, without preamble, setting the letter on the counter between them because Morrison was right there, and there was nothing private about any of it. He can come within the month. He says he'll do the survey for a fair rate, and he'll provide a signed affidavit for the council. Adelaide set down the tin of coffee she was holding. That is excellent news. We should coordinate with the other homesteaders, get them all on board to allow the survey on their land. Bryce will want access to the full stretch of the southern branch. I can ride to the Aldriches and the Hendersons tomorrow, she said. Pete Gruber will want to hear it from someone himself. He doesn't trust written correspondence much. I'll go to Gruber, Levi said. He knows me from the Cattlemen's Association. He might be easier to convince if it comes from me first. Adelaide studied him for a moment. He was leaning against the counter with the easy balance of a man who spent most of his life on his feet or in the saddle, and there was nothing calculated in his expression. He was simply a man who had said he would help and who was, consequently, helping. She had met men who promised and men who performed, and she had learned young that they were not always the same species. I appreciate this, Mr. Donnelly, she said. Genuinely. Levi, he said. If we're going to be riding around coordinating surveys together, we may as well drop the formalities. She hesitated only briefly. Adelaide, then. He smiled at that, not widely, not in a way that required comment, just a quiet warming of his expression that she found, to her mild alarm, entirely pleasant to look at. The following weeks brought them into a rhythm of collaboration that felt surprisingly natural. Thomas Bryce arrived on a Tuesday at the end of August, a compact, methodical man of about 60 with a surveyor's kit and a manner that suggested he had measured more things than most people had noticed. Levi rode with him and Adelaide to each of the homesteads along the southern branch, and over 3 days they walked the creek banks and took measurements and interviewed each family about their water dependency. Adelaide watched Levi during those days with the careful attention of someone who was trying to understand a new thing. He was easy with people in a way she had not expected easy with old Pete Gruber, who distrusted strangers, easy with the Henderson children who climbed on the fence rails and demanded his attention, easy with Esteban, who spoke primarily in Spanish, and with whom Levi conversed in that same language with a fluency that made Esteban laugh for the first time in Adelaide's recent memory. "You speak Spanish," she said, the second afternoon, when Esteban had gone back to show Diego something about the survey equipment. "Grew up partly in New Mexico territory," Levi said. "My father had a trading post. Half the people we dealt with spoke Spanish as their first language. You pick it up. How did you come to be in Harlan Creek?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek, which ran shallow and clear over its sandy bed, bordered by cottonwood trees that rustled even when no wind was obvious. "I came through 8 years ago with a cattle drive. Liked the land, bought a small parcel, built it up over time." He paused. "It suited me. Do you have family here?" "A brother in Amarillo. Our parents passed some years back." He looked at her sideways. "You?" "I grew up in Missouri. My parents are still there, both of them, thank God. I came out here when Robert got the farm. This was his dream, really, the land." She looked at it, her land, the dry gold grass and the dark soil and the silver thread of the creek. "I suppose it became mine." She had not said it quite that simply before. The land had always felt like something she was maintaining, keeping alive for Robert's memory. But as she said it, she realized it had quietly, without her noticing exactly when, become hers. She had decided that somewhere along the way without making a ceremony of the decision. Levi did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "It's good land." "It is," she agreed. Thomas Bryce delivered his report to the county commissioner's office in early September, and its conclusions were unambiguous. The redirection of the southern branch as proposed by the consortium would reduce water flow to the 11 homesteads by between 62 and 78% during the 3 driest months of the year. He attached maps. He attached measurements. He attached his professional credentials and the signatures of each affected landowner. The next town meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday of September, and Adelaide prepared for it the way she had prepared for nothing since Clara was born, with a focus so total that everything else fell away. She rewrote her address 3 times. She organized Bryce's findings into a clear summary. She rehearsed in the kitchen with Clara as her audience, and Clara, sitting at the table with her chin in her hands, offered criticism with the unsparing honesty of children. "You say therefore too much," Clara said. "I do not," Adelaide said, and then looking at her papers, "I will fix that." Levi came by the farm 2 days before the meeting. He came on the gray quarter horse. She had learned the horse's name was Colt, which seemed an unlikely name for a horse that was clearly at least 8 years old, but Levi had named it Young and saw no reason to revise. And he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and reviewed Bryce's summary with her. Clara, who had been outside with the chickens, materialized in the doorway and looked at Levi with the full, assessing gravity that children apply to new adults. "You're the man who helped Mama at the meeting," Clara said. "That's right," Levi said. "Your Mama helped herself mostly. I just asked to listen. Mama says you speak Spanish. A little. Can you say something?" Levi looked at Adelaide, who lifted her hands helplessly, and then he turned to Clara and said, in easy, accented Spanish, that she seemed like a very serious person, which he meant as a compliment, and that her mother was very brave, which was also a compliment. Clara processed this. What did you say? I said you ask good questions. Clara seemed satisfied with this, and went to sit at the far end of the table with a piece of bread and butter, occasionally looking up at Levi with the measuring eyes of someone who was still deciding. Later, after Clara was in bed and the lamps were low and they had gone over everything twice, Levi sat back in his chair and looked at her with the expression he got sometimes, the one that was harder to read than his usual straightforwardness. "You're not nervous," he said. "I am terribly nervous," she said. "I have just had enough practice at functioning while nervous that it no longer shows." He laughed a real laugh, short and genuine, and she had heard him laugh before, but it still caught her slightly off guard every time. It was a laugh that was completely his, unself-conscious and unhurried, the laugh of a man who was not performing anything. "Fair enough," he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Adelaide, can I say something?" She looked at him. Something in his tone had shifted, become more careful. "Of course. What you've done these past 2 months, gathering those letters, finding Bryce, coordinating all those homesteaders, building the case, it would have been a lot for anyone. And you did it while running a farm and raising a daughter and not once asking for more than you needed." He paused. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the look of a man choosing words the way a person picks their footing on uncertain ground. "I just think it's worth saying that you're remarkable." The words sat between them like something placed carefully on a shelf. Adelaide did not say anything immediately. She was aware of something happening in the room that had not been happening a moment before, something that had probably been happening for weeks if she was honest, building quietly in the spaces between conversations and shared miles and small, meaningful looks. "You didn't have to do any of this either," she said softly. "None of it was your fight. It became mine," he said. And he met her eyes then, and the look was plain and serious and entirely without pretense. She did not look away. "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. "Because somewhere around the second day of that survey, when you were arguing with Thomas Bryce about the precision of his measurement at the third marker, and you were absolutely right and you both knew it, I realized I had stopped thinking about the water rights at all." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I was paying attention to entirely the wrong thing." The lamp on the table between them made the light close and warm. Outside, the night insects had started their chorus. Adelaide felt something moving in her like the first water through a field after a long drought, slow and then all at once. "I don't know what I am yet," she said honestly. "I am still learning how to be just myself without being anyone's wife. And Clara needs—" "I'm not asking you for anything," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "I am only telling you the truth. What you do with it is your affair entirely." She nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the truth," she said. "I am not certain what I have to offer in return yet, but I appreciate the truth." He smiled then, that quiet, warming smile. "That's more than enough," he said. He rode home under the stars, and she stood on the porch for a while after he was gone, listening to the night and trying to identify what she was feeling, which was complicated but not, she thought, unwelcome. The September town meeting was the fullest Adelaide had ever seen. Word had spread about the water rights dispute in the way that things spread in small communities, through the general store and the church pews and the front porches and the barber shop, and people had come who had never come before. The hall was packed shoulder to shoulder, and the air was immediately warm even before the lamps were fully lit. Wendell Beaumont was there in the front row again, but this time there were 6 men with him instead of the usual 3, which told Adelaide that he had been busy. His lawyer, a man named Crawford who had come up from Amarillo, specifically for the occasion, sat at the end of the row with a leather briefcase across his knees. Mayor Hargrove called the meeting to order and began to work through the formalities with an efficiency that suggested he was aware of the pressure in the room and wanted to manage it. When he reached the water rights issue, he presented Thomas Bryce's survey report to the council himself, which was a sign that the document had at least been taken seriously. Crawford stood up and immediately challenged Bryce's methodology. He did it smoothly, the challenge of a man who had done this many times in many rooms. He questioned the precision of the measurements, suggested that the survey had been commissioned by interested parties and was therefore biased, and implied that the consortium had alternative studies that showed a different conclusion. Adelaide stood up. She had her papers, but she also had 3 months of very careful thinking, and she had spent the previous evening reading every legal guideline she could find relating to water rights in the state of Texas. She addressed Crawford's points one by one. She cited the specific survey methodology Bryce had used, which was the same methodology used by the Army Corps of Engineers. She noted that Bryce had been engaged before any of the affected homesteaders knew the details of the consortium's proposal, which undermined the bias argument. And she asked Crawford, pleasantly and directly, to produce the alternative studies he had referenced, since they had not been submitted to the council and therefore did not officially exist. Crawford sat down. He did not look comfortable. From the fourth row, and she had noticed, without making it obvious that she had noticed, that Levi had sat in exactly the same seat as the first time, she heard him say, quietly enough that it was to no one in particular but loud enough to be heard, "Good." The council took 30 minutes to deliberate. When they returned, the commissioner, a man named Aldgate who was younger than his predecessor and had, apparently, more of a conscience, announced that the consortium's petition was denied. The southern branch of Harlan Creek would remain under its current distribution as established by the 1869 survey, with a formal protection order placed on record. The sound that went through the hall was complicated and loud. Adelaide stood very still in the middle of it, holding her papers, feeling something immense and quiet settling through her. She was surrounded almost immediately. Old Pete Gruber grabbed her hand with both of his and shook it wordlessly, eyes bright. The Henderson family's mother, a red-faced woman named Ruth, hugged her hard enough to display several pins from her hair. Esteban was there. She had not realized he had come, and he nodded at her with a gravity that she understood completely. When she finally emerged from the crowd into the cooler air of the night, Levi was waiting by the horses. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not quite pride, because it was not his victory to be proud of something, more like wonder, as if she had just done something he had not quite fully expected, even though he had believed in her entirely. "You took Crawford apart," he said. "He was overconfident," she said. "Overconfidence leaves gaps." "Where did you learn to argue like that?" She thought about it. "My father. He was a county surveyor, actually. He believed that numbers told the truth when people didn't." Levi looked at her for a moment. Then, with a deliberateness that she noticed, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so ordinary and so intimate that it stopped her breath. "I'm glad you stood up in that meeting," he said. "Someone told me to sit," she said, looking up at him. "Someone was wrong," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and uncalculated, and it felt like something opening. He laughed too, and for a moment they were just two people standing in the Texas night, laughing, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing. "Walk with me," she said, "before we go back." They walked along the main street of Harlan Creek, past the lit windows of the saloon and the dark front of the schoolhouse, and the church with its white paint faintly luminous in the moonlight. They talked about nothing and everything. His brother in Amarillo, who was terrible at writing letters, her parents in Missouri who were not, the particular blue of the sky in late October when the weather began to turn, whether Clara would be amenable to a puppy, which she would obviously adore and which Adelaide was not certain her nerves could accommodate. "I think you should get her the puppy," Levi said. "You're not the one who will be responsible for the puppy." "No, but I'd enjoy watching you pretend to be annoyed about the puppy while actually enjoying it." She looked at him sideways. "You have a very specific vision of what I would do." "I've been paying attention," he said simply. The simplicity of it undid her a little. She looked at the moonlit street and felt the enormity of what had been quietly happening over these weeks. How this man had walked into her life at the precise moment she had raised her voice and refused to sit, and how he had stayed, and how each conversation and each shared mile of dusty road had built something between them that she was no longer pretending she did not feel. "Levi," she said. "Yes." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her. The moonlight was good on his face made it serious and kind at once, the way she thought of him now as the most genuinely kind, serious person she had met in a very long time. "I have been thinking about what you said the other night," she said, "about paying attention to the wrong thing." He was very still, and, "I have been doing the same," she said, "possibly for longer." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm and work-roughened and completely certain, and she held on to it. "I'm not asking for anything rushed," he said. "I know where things are with you. I know you're still finding your feet. I just want to be in your life, Adelaide. Whatever shape that takes, I want to be here." She looked at their joined hands for a moment, then she looked at him. "That's all I'm asking for too," she said. "To not be asked for more than is possible right now, to have something that is patient." "I am very patient," he said. "You have demonstrated that," she said. He smiled. And then, in the quiet of the moonlit Texas street, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, brief and deliberate and full of intention. And she closed her eyes and let herself feel it, the whole of it, without editing or qualifying. "Come to dinner Sunday," she said when she opened her eyes. "Clara will want to show you her drawings. She has been doing them all week. Apparently there is one of you on your horse and she is very proud of it." He laughed. "I wouldn't miss it," he said. They walked back to the horses in comfortable silence, and when they parted at the hitching post, she felt lighter than she had in 2 years or possibly longer. The autumn came in gently, which was not always the way of the Texas Panhandle. September softened into October, and the light changed from its flat white summer glare to something warmer and more horizontal, gold in the mornings and amber in the evenings, and the air carried a smell of dry grass and distance that was, Adelaide had decided, one of the genuinely beautiful things about this country. Levi came to Sunday dinner, and then the Sunday after that and the one after that. What began as an occasional arrangement became, without formal negotiation, a weekly fixture. He would arrive on Colt in the late morning, and Clara would hear the horse before anyone else and appear from wherever she had been to announce his arrival to the entire farm, as if it were news. Esteban and Diego had developed an easy familiarity with him, and after dinner, the 3 men would sometimes sit on the porch talking about the condition of the pasture land or the behavior of particular cattle, while Adelaide cleared the table and listened from inside with one window open. She watched Clara with him. She watched carefully, the way a mother watches everything that concerns her child, because Clara's welfare was not a thing she could afford to be romantic about. Clara, who had been 4 years old when her father died, and who remembered him in the warm, fragmented way of very young children, was not a girl who transferred her affection lightly. She was serious and particular, and she took her time. But she took to Levi. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way it always happened with Clara, in small tests that she devised unconsciously. She asked him hard questions about things she cared about. Why the creek ran faster in some places than others, why horses seemed sadder in the rain, whether he had ever seen a rattlesnake and what it looked like, and whether he had been afraid. He answered every question without condescension, without the fake brightness that adults often adopted for children, but as if her questions were genuinely interesting, because he appeared to find them genuinely interesting. The day Adelaide understood that Clara had fully decided was the afternoon Levi's gray horse got loose from the fence post a loose knot. Entirely Levi's fault, and Colt went trotting off into the south pasture with excellent equine indifference. And Clara ran after him without hesitation, small boots kicking up dust, and cut him off at the corner of the fence with a technique she had apparently invented on the spot, involving a piece of hay and a lot of confidence, and brought him back to Levi with the gravity of a person who had done something very satisfactory. Levi hunkered down to her level and said, with complete sincerity, "That was the best horse catch I have ever personally witnessed, and I have been around horses my whole life." Clara's expression did not change dramatically, but there was something in her eyes that was clear and sure, and she patted Colt on the nose and went back to what she had been doing. That evening, after Levi had gone, Clara came into the kitchen and stood beside Adelaide at the counter where she was rolling biscuit dough. "Mama," Clara said. "Yes, Levi is good." Adelaide kept her hands on the dough. She felt the warmth of the statement pressing against her chest. "I think so too," she said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and went to bed. October became November, and the work of the farm shifted with the season. There was fence to repair before the winter weather, and the root cellar to stock, and the matter of the north pasture gate that had been on Adelaide's list since July. Levi came by on weekdays sometimes, not always by arrangement, sometimes because he had been in the area with a particular purpose, and sometimes, she suspected, simply because he was thinking of them. He always found something useful to do. He never asked for credit for it. One evening in early November, he came in from fixing the gate on the north pasture to find her at the table with the farm ledger and an expression that she had not intended anyone to see. He sat down across from her without comment, and after a moment she put the ledger down. "The winter will be tighter than I planned," she said. "The summer was good, but the equipment repairs took more than I had anticipated, and the well pump." "How tight?" he said. Not alarmed, practical. She told him the numbers. He looked at them with the same seriousness he gave everything. "You have the root cellar stocked?" "Yes. Enough feed for the animals through February, just barely." "Then you'll make it through the winter," he said. "The spring will be better. The water rights are secured now, which means a reliable growing season. That changes the numbers considerably." She knew this, but something about hearing it plainly from someone else, someone whose judgment she trusted, untangled a knot between her shoulder blades that she had been carrying since she opened the ledger. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. She had not meant to say that exactly, but there it was. Levi looked at her steadily. "You are a woman running a farm and raising a child and fighting the county's most powerful cattlemen in the middle of a Texas summer," he said. "You are not in any configuration of the word a burden." She laughed a little despite herself. "That's a very generous reading." "It's an accurate reading," he said. He leaned forward with his forearms on the table. "Adelaide, you can talk to me about the ledger. You can talk to me about the winter or the well pump or whatever the next hard thing is. I'm not going to think less of you for having a hard year. Everyone has hard years." "Have you?" she asked, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, I lost most of my herd to a fever that went through the county. Lost about 40% in 6 weeks. Had to sell off land to cover the debt." He looked at the table. "I don't talk about it much because I got through it and there's no sense in dwelling. But yes, it was a very bad year." "How did you manage?" "Slowly," he said simply. "One thing at a time." He looked up. "The way people always manage." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while with the lamp between them and the wind finding its way under the door seam, and the whole of the evening was very quiet and entirely enough. December arrived and brought with it the cold that the Panhandle did not apologize for, hard, dry, blowing cold that came from the north, and found every gap in every wall. Adelaide added more wood to the stove and added another quilt to Clara's bed, and went about the winter work with the same steady efficiency she brought to all work, season by season. Levi had his own ranch to manage through the cold months, and they saw each other less. The roads were harder, the days shorter, the demands of winter farming relentless. But he came when he could, and when he came the house felt different, felt inhabited in a particular way that she had stopped lying to herself about. She missed him when he was absent. She had not expected to feel that so clearly, but she did. Clara, who noticed most things and commented on many of them, told her one afternoon in December, "Mama, you look at the road a lot." "There is a great deal happening on the road," Adelaide said. "There is not," Clara said. "There is usually nothing at all." Adelaide did not attempt to argue with this. The week before Christmas, Levi arrived with a small package wrapped in brown paper and a length of red ribbon that he had clearly done himself because the bow was not quite right. He gave it to Clara first, which was correct. It was a small hand-carved wooden horse, painted gray, that he had made himself over the course of several weeks, and Clara held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was her version of being completely overwhelmed. Then he gave Adelaide hers, which was a book. Not a practical book, a collection of poetry, small and leather-bound, the kind of thing that felt considered rather than convenient. "I didn't know what you read," he said, "but I thought you might like this one." She opened it to the first page. It smelled of old paper and something faintly of cedar. She looked up at him, and the feeling in her chest was very full and very clear, and she thought, with a certainty that surprised her not at all, that she was in love with this man. Had been for some time. Had simply been waiting until she was certain that it was real and not loneliness or gratitude or need, and she was now certain. She did not say it. Not yet. But she looked at him in the lamplight with the book in her hands, and she thought he could probably see it anyway, because he was a man who paid attention, and she suspected that there was very little he missed. "Thank you," she said. "This is genuinely thoughtful." "Merry Christmas, Adelaide," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Levi." Clara appeared between them with her carved horse and held it up. "She needs a name," she said. "What do you think?" Levi asked her. Clara considered it with the gravity of the naming process. "Pearl," she said, "like Mama's horse." "Pearl is a very good name," he said. The new year came quietly, and with it came the first real thaw of February, which was tentative and sometimes false in the panhandle, but which opened the sky and turned the light a thin, promising blue. Adelaide rode out to check the south pasture, and stood for a moment listening to the creek, which was running fuller and cleaner than she had heard it since the previous spring. And she thought about the meeting in July and the papers in her hand, and the man who had stood up and said he wanted to hear more. And she understood that everything that had followed was connected to that moment. Not in a romantic sense exactly, but in the way that one real decision leads to other real things. And she had made a real decision standing up in that hall, and the world had responded with something real in return. She did not believe in simple providence. She believed in work and stubbornness and occasionally good luck. But she allowed herself, standing by the creek in the February light, the small private gratitude of knowing that something in her life had turned toward something good. The spring brought its rush of work, and she was glad for all of it. The planting season began in late March, and she and Esteban and Diego worked the south fields in a state of cooperative exhaustion that she had come to love, the specific tiredness of good labor, the kind that sat in your muscles and let you sleep soundly. Clara helped in the kitchen garden with a seriousness that was clearly modeled on watching her mother, though she also frequently stopped to observe the earthworms and report on them in detail. Levi came on Sundays as ever, and some Saturdays, and sometimes on a weekday when he had business in town, and the road ran past her farm on the way back. The something between them had not resolved itself into a formal shape, but it was unmistakably present, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. One April afternoon, they were walking the south fence line together, a genuine working walk, checking the posts and wire, when Levi stopped at the corner post and turned to her with the deliberate expression she had come to recognize as his serious face, the one that meant he had been thinking something over for a while and had arrived at the point of saying it. "Adelaide," he said. "I hear it," she said, meaning his tone. He smiled briefly. "I have been trying to think of how to say this properly, and I have concluded that I don't have a properly to offer. I'm better at doing than at saying." "I've noticed," she said. She waited. He looked at her steadily. "I would like to court you," he said. "Formally, if that means something to you, or informally, if that suits better. I am not asking you to decide anything beyond that. I'm asking for the right to try." The April sun was warm on her shoulders. The creek was audible from here, running quick with snowmelt from the distant mountains. She looked at him, This man who had stood up for her in a crowded hall and helped her fight a battle that was not his and come to her Sunday table, and made a wooden horse for her daughter, and given her a book of poetry, and fixed her fence, and sat with her at her kitchen table and seen her the real her, the capable and tired and determined and lonely and occasionally funny and sometimes frightened her, and had gone on looking without flinching. "You have been courting me since October," she said. "I know," he said, "but I would like to do it with your knowledge and permission." "You've had my knowledge since October," she said. "The permission was implied." He exhaled something between a laugh and a breath of relief. "All right," he said. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," she said. He reached over and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, and they walked on down the fence line in the spring warmth, checking the posts, and it was the most domestic and contented she had felt in a very long time. The formal courtship, as it was now officially called by both of them, and unofficially called by the entire town of Harlan Creek, which had been watching with undisguised interest since approximately October, proceeded through the spring with a sweetness that Adelaide had not anticipated. Not because she had not believed sweetness was possible, but because she had expected it to feel more fragile. Instead, it felt solid. Solid the way the farm felt after a good season's work, not effortless, but earned and therefore reliable. Levi took her to the spring social in town at the end of May. It was the first social event she had attended since Robert's death where she had not felt the particular weight of being pitied, the widow at the dance, the object of sympathetic glances. She arrived on Levi's arm and felt none of that, or felt it dissolving quickly under the simple reality of being there with someone who made her feel present rather than absent. They danced twice, because she liked dancing and had missed it, and he was a competent dancer in the practical way of men who have learned because dancing was expected rather than because they particularly wanted to. But he danced with her as if he was enjoying it, which she suspected he was because he was looking at her the entire time with that quiet particular attention. Ruth Henderson, who was dancing nearby with her husband, leaned over between songs and said to Adelaide not quietly enough, "That is a good man." "Yes," Adelaide said, and did not elaborate because she did not need to. Wendell Beaumont was at the social, as he was at every social event in the county, because that was how men like Beaumont maintained their position. He did not approach Adelaide, but he looked at her across the room once with an expression that she read as recalibrated respect, and she looked back with an expression that she hoped communicated that she was entirely comfortable and would remain so, and then they both went about their evenings, and that was the end of it. June arrived, and with it a heat that was not yet the brutal flat heat of midsummer but was building toward it, and one evening when Levi was sitting on the porch with her in the cooler air after supper, with the fireflies beginning their work in the tall grass along the fence line, he said something that she had been half expecting and also entirely caught off guard by. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to do it right. I want to ask Clara first." She looked at him. Something deep in her chest moved. "You want to ask Clara's permission?" "I think she deserves to be asked," he said. "She's losing her father's name. She's gaining a different life. That deserves a conversation." Adelaide did not speak for a moment. She was looking at the fireflies and at the blue dark above the fence line, and she was thinking about everything this man was and had been, and the whole of it felt she searched for the right word and found it worthy. Not perfect. Worthy. "Yes," she said. "You should ask her." He asked Clara the following Sunday morning privately on the porch, while Adelaide stayed inside and absolutely did not try to hear, though she tried to hear. Clara came inside 20 minutes later with the carved wooden horse under her arm and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her mother. "He asked if I would mind," Clara said. "What did you tell him?" Clara considered this with characteristic deliberateness. "I told him that I already called him Levi and not Mr., and that means he is family already, and family does not ask permission they already have." Adelaide pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. "That's what you said." "Yes." Adelaide stood up and went to Clara and put her arms around her daughter and held her, and Clara allowed this with a dignified patience that was entirely her father's and entirely her own. Levi came through the door a few minutes later with a look on his face that suggested Clara had rendered him temporarily speechless, which was not an easy thing to do. "Did she tell you what she said?" he asked. "She did," Adelaide said. He shook his head with an expression of helpless fondness. "She is remarkable." "I know," Adelaide said. "I have been telling people that for 7 years." He proposed properly on a Tuesday evening in June, which was not a special day except that it was the day he felt ready and the day she felt ready, and sometimes that is enough. He did not have a grand plan for it. He simply came to the kitchen where she was making bread and stood beside her at the counter and said, "Adelaide, will you marry me?" She had flour on her hands. She did not wipe them. She turned and looked at him, and what she felt was not the dizzy uncertainty of a young woman in the first storm of love, but something better, the settled, clear, warm certainty of a woman who had thought carefully and decided well. "Yes," she said. He took her flour-covered hands in his anyway, and she laughed. And then she stopped laughing because he kissed her properly for the first time, really kissed her, with his hands holding hers and the warm bread smell around them and the late evening light through the kitchen window. And it was the best thing that had happened in the kitchen in as long as she could remember. "You got flour on your shirt," she said when they separated. "I'll live," he said. They were married in September, 1 year, almost exactly, from the night she had stood up in Pemberton Hall and refused to sit. The wedding was small by design and Adelaide's preference. The ceremony was in the little church on Main Street, with the Aldrich family and the Hendersons and Pete Gruber and Esteban and Diego, and Levi's brother Marcus, who had come down from Amarillo, a taller version of Levi who had the same quiet manner but a much louder laugh, and Adelaide's friend from the church women's group, Margaret, who cried immediately and enthusiastically. Clara was the flower girl. She performed this role with the absolute seriousness of a diplomat on a critical mission, distributing the dried wildflowers with such precision and deliberateness that it took twice as long as anyone had anticipated, but nobody minded. Adelaide wore her best dress, which was a deep blue with small pearl buttons that had been her mother's, which her mother had sent in a trunk from Missouri, along with a letter that made Adelaide cry on a Wednesday morning, in a way she had not cried in a long time, the specific cry of being loved from a distance, of being known across years and miles. She pinned her hair up with care, and she felt beautiful, and she did not feel it in spite of the years and the hard work and the grief, but because of them, because she had not stopped, and she was still here, and here was very good. Levi stood at the front of the church with Marcus beside him, and he watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the look of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, and who felt it completely. The vows were spoken in a plain wooden church with sunlight coming through ordinary glass and a slight smell of wood polish and candle wax, and they were spoken to each other the way everything important had been said between them, clearly, without performance, meaning every word. The reception was in the Aldrich family's barn, which had been cleaned out and hung with paper lanterns, and there was fiddle music and food that half the town had contributed to, and dancing that went on until the stars came out over the open barn doors. Adelaide danced with Levi and with Marcus and with old Pete Gruber, who turned out to be surprisingly light on his feet, and finally with Clara, who had decided that dancing was acceptable as long as she led. Marcus Donnelly pulled her aside at one point in the evening when Levi was talking with Esteban near the food table, and he said, looking at his brother with the quiet assessment of a man who knew someone very well, "He's been different since he came back from that first town meeting and told me about you. I didn't know what to make of it then. I do now." "What did he say about me?" Adelaide asked. Marcus smiled. "He said there was a woman who stood up in a room full of people telling her to sit, and she held her ground like she owned the air around her. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He looked at her. He was right." Adelaide looked across the barn at Levi, who was laughing at something Esteban had said, and she felt the words she had been thinking to herself for months rise up and take its proper place, uncomplicated and entire. Love. It was love. The plain, solid, particular love of knowing a person and choosing them and being chosen in return, and all the daily work of it ahead. They settled together with the practicality that two people with farms and responsibilities and a daughter to think of must settle. The question of whose property to live on was answered by the simple fact that Adelaide's farm was the more established operation and the more in need of continued attention, and by the parallel fact that Levi's ranch, somewhat larger, with its own herd and hired hands, could be managed partly from a distance with the right arrangements in place. They consolidated what made sense to consolidate and kept what made sense to keep separate, and by the first winter of their marriage, they had a functional combined household that worked with the efficient, slightly improvised logic of two independent people learning to share a life. The first winter of their marriage was also, as these things often are, the most revealing. The closeness of a winter farmhouse was a particular test. Adelaide was a woman who thought out loud and who organized her thinking by talking, which Levi found mostly pleasant and occasionally overwhelming. Levi was a man who needed occasional hours of complete quiet, which Adelaide found mostly understandable and occasionally, when she was full of things she wanted to say, slightly frustrating. These were not problems. They were the adjustments of two formed people learning the shape of the space they now shared, and they made the adjustments with the goodwill that comes from genuinely wanting the other person to be comfortable. Clara adjusted to Levi's presence in the permanent sense, which was somewhat different from his presence as a Sunday visitor, with her characteristic deliberateness. There was a week in October when she was quieter than usual and spent more time in her room, and Adelaide understood that she was processing, and she gave her the space to process without making a performance of the giving. And then one morning Clara came to the breakfast table and asked Levi if he would teach her to ride properly, not just to sit on Pearl and walk around the yard, but to actually ride, and he said yes. And from that day forward the matter was settled in Clara's interior accounting, and she never revisited it. The riding lessons began on Saturday mornings in the south pasture, and Adelaide sometimes watched from the fence rail with a cup of coffee and observed the two of them, Levi endlessly patient, Clara fiercely determined, Pearl remarkably cooperative for a horse that had strong opinions about things, and felt the uncomplicated pleasure of watching two people she loved in the act of becoming close. Spring came in its usual way, the earth loosening and the creek running high, and Adelaide found herself in the early weeks of April with a particular tiredness she recognized. She sat with the knowledge of it for a week before she said anything, which was long enough to be certain. She told Levi on a Wednesday evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper. This had become their habit, the porch in the evening, and she put her coffee cup down and looked at the dark outline of the distant hills and said, "I'm expecting." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. He said it with a quiet, particular astonishment that was entirely different from surprise, as if the fact of it was so large that only a small word could hold it. "Yes," she said. He put his hand over hers on the porch railing. He looked out at the same hills she had been looking at, and she watched his profile in the fading light, and what she saw there was joy, careful, deep, steadying joy. "How do you feel?" he said. "Tired," she said, "and very well." They told Clara on Sunday. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone receiving significant information, and when they finished explaining, she said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know until the spring," Adelaide said. Clara thought about this. "I would prefer a brother," she said. "I have opinions about too many things already, and two of me might be difficult." The look that passed between Adelaide and Levi over Clara's head contained approximately 47 things. The pregnancy moved through the summer months with Adelaide's typical stubbornness regarding what she would and would not slow down for. Levi attempted, with the gentle persistence of a man who understood that direct commands were not going to be effective, to get her to delegate more of the heavy work. She delegated what was reasonable and continued with the rest, and he gradually accepted this because he understood her well enough by now to know that the work was part of how she was in the world, and that removing it would take something essential from her. She did accept help from Margaret, her friend from church, who came twice a week and was good company and brought opinions about baby names that she offered freely and without apology. "James is a strong name," Margaret said one August afternoon. "It's a very common name," Adelaide said. "Common names are common because they work." "This is not a convincing argument." "What about William?" "Clara's late grandfather was named William and she has complex feelings about the name." "Henry." Adelaide looked at Levi, who was in the corner of the kitchen mending a harness and pretending not to be listening. "Henry," she said, testing it. He looked up. "Henry is good," he said. "Henry it is," Adelaide said. "What if it's a girl?" Margaret said. "It won't be," Clara said, from the table where she was doing her schoolwork. This was stated with the authority of someone who had decided the matter. Henry James Donnelly arrived in late November during the first real cold snap of the season, when the wind was coming hard from the north and the fields were already frosted silver. The labor was long and serious, and Levi stayed close, not in the room, because that was not the custom, but on the other side of the door, in a state of contained but unmistakable vigilance that Margaret reported to Adelaide between contractions, saying that he had sat in the same chair without moving for 4 hours and looked like a man trying to do useful things with his hands and not finding any. When it was done and Margaret came to the door and told him he could come in, he came in quietly and sat at the edge of the bed and looked at Henry, who was very small and very red and emphatically present. And Adelaide watched Levi's face in that moment, watched the absolute wordless enormity of it, and thought that there were no adequate words for what was in his expression, and that the absence of words was exactly right. "Hello," he said softly to Henry. Just that. Clara was brought in shortly after. She stood by the bed and looked at Henry with a critical eye. "He's very wrinkled," she said. "He just arrived," Adelaide said. "He'll sort out. He looks like Levi's brother." "He looks like himself," Levi said. "He's just doing his first impression." Clara considered Henry carefully for another moment. Then she put one very careful finger against his small fist, and Henry, with the remarkable and indiscriminate certainty of newborns, curled his fingers around hers. Clara's expression changed entirely. Something in her face went open and soft in a way that Adelaide had never seen before, and she stood very still with her finger caught in Henry's grip, and nobody in the room said anything at all. The winter passed in the particular haze of new parenthood, the interrupted nights, and the careful rhythms of feeding and sleeping, and the constant low-level astonishment of watching a person arrive fully from nowhere. Adelaide moved through it with the experience of having done this once before, and the advantage of having a partner who participated without reservation. Levi rose in the night without being asked, and took Henry when Henry was inconsolable, and walked him around the kitchen talking to him in a low, continuous murmur that Adelaide sometimes heard through the bedroom wall and found deeply comforting. Clara, for her part, took the role of elder sibling with a dedication that bordered on professional. She had opinions about how Henry should be positioned and what sounds soothed him, and which of the blankets was clearly superior. She was right about most of it, which meant that they listened to her, which meant that she became more confident in her opinions, which meant that they had created an extremely informed 8-year-old. Spring came again. The farm came back to life with its usual demanding urgency. Henry spent his first spring mornings in a basket under the cottonwood tree by the creek while Adelaide worked the kitchen garden, and he regarded the world with the wide, serious eyes of a person with a great deal to learn and no particular rush about it. The water rights held. The consortium made no further attempts on the southern branch, and the arrangement settled into the ordinary invisible infrastructure of the county, unremarkable and protected. Adelaide sent Thomas Bryce a letter of thanks on the anniversary of the settlement, which she did every year, because she had not forgotten what his survey had meant, and she believed that gratitude, like most good things, was worth the effort of maintaining. The second summer of their marriage was the best summer Adelaide had had on the farm, measured by output and measured by every other meaningful category. The South fields produced well, the equipment held, and she and Levi had found their working rhythm, the way that two people who both know what they are doing eventually learn to work together as something more efficient than either of them separately. Esteban told her in July that the place felt different from when she had first arrived, by which he meant that it felt like a proper home, and she took that as high praise from a man who did not offer it carelessly. One afternoon in August, when the heat was serious and the work was done for the day and Henry was sleeping and Clara was reading on the porch, Levi found her standing by the south fence looking at the creek. He stood beside her, and they looked at it together for a while. "You're thinking about the meeting," he said. She smiled. She had not known it was so obvious. "I was thinking about standing up in that hall and being so certain I was about to make a fool of myself." "You weren't even close to foolish," he said. "I didn't know that then." She paused. "When you stood up, when you said you wanted to hear more, I didn't know what to think." "What did you think?" She considered it honestly. "I thought, here is a man who is either going to complicate everything or make it considerably better, and I am not sure which." "Which was it?" he said. She looked at him, this man who was her husband and her partner and the best daily company she had ever had, and who had come into her life at the precise moment she had chosen to use her voice rather than yield it. "Both," she said. "Primarily the second." He laughed, and she laughed too, and the creek ran on beside them with its old and indifferent constancy, silver in the August afternoon light. That evening Levi sat on the porch with Henry asleep against his chest, and Clara beside him with her book, and Adelaide brought out coffee and stood in the doorway for a moment before she came out, looking at the three of them in the evening light, and felt the thing she had felt in pieces for a long time now arriving fully and at once. Not completion, exactly. She had learned enough about real life not to use that word, because real life was always in process, always mid-season, always with some fence to mend and some winter to prepare for. But something close to it, the feeling of a life that had been built out of real materials, honest work and honest feeling and decisions made with courage rather than comfort, and that was, in the way of things made from real materials, solid. She came out and sat beside Levi, and he shifted Henry's weight naturally to make room for her, and Clara looked up from her book briefly and then back, and the fireflies began their work in the tall grass. "I have been thinking," Clara said, without looking up from her book. "That is a regular occurrence with you," Adelaide said. "I think we should get a dog," Clara said. Adelaide and Levi looked at each other. "A dog," Levi said. "Henry will want a dog when he's older," Clara said. "We should acquire it now so it's already established before he asks." "That is extremely sophisticated reasoning," Levi said. "I know." Adelaide looked at the fence line where the fireflies were thickest and thought about what she had told Levi once about the puppy, that she was not certain her nerves could accommodate it. She looked at her daughter, methodical and determined. She looked at Levi, who was looking at her with the expression that meant he already knew what she was going to say and was prepared to find it thoroughly enjoyable. "Fine," Adelaide said. "We'll get the dog." Clara lowered her book and nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose campaign had been brief and successful. The following spring, Clara was now 9. Henry was almost a year old and walking with the cheerful unsteadiness of someone new to legs. They got the dog. He was a brown and white cattle dog, young and eager and completely without dignity, and Clara named him after a full week of deliberation and arrived at Scout, which seemed right to everyone. Scout proved to be everything Adelaide had imagined and also slightly more chaos than she had anticipated. But the chaos was the good kind, the kind that made the farm louder and the mornings more interesting and Clara and Henry both brighter-eyed. Adelaide turned 34 that spring, and the birthday was marked by a dinner that Levi and Clara cooked together in an alliance that produced something creditable, and also produced an impressive amount of flour on the floor. She sat at the head of the table with Henry on her knee and Clara and Levi across from her, and Scout pressed against her ankles hoping for something to fall, and she looked at all of it, the messy, full, specific reality of this life, and thought that she would not trade a single complicated inch of it. There were hard things. There were always hard things. A dry spell in the summer of the following year that made the irrigation work harder and the finances tighter. A winter illness that took Henry down for 3 weeks and made Adelaide feel the particular terror of a parent watching a small child struggle. A dispute with a neighbor over fence line that required careful handling and patience. The ordinary sustained effort of keeping a farm and a family alive in a country that did not accommodate weakness. But through all of it, there was Levi, steady and specific and entirely present, never absent in the way that mattered, always there when the thing that needed doing was the serious thing. She had learned his rhythms and he had learned hers, and they had built something between them that was stronger for being chosen by two people who knew what they were choosing. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been in the summer of 1878, 31 years old and frightened and stubborn, standing in a hot hall with papers in her hands, refusing to sit, and felt something for that woman that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but something in between the two. Tenderness, perhaps, an understanding of what it had cost her to stand and what it had given her, and she thought about the man who had stood up in the 4th row. She mentioned it to him once, on an evening in early fall, the kind of fall evening the Panhandle offered as if in apology for what it had done all summer. All still air and golden light, and the smell of turned earth. "Do you remember what you thought when you stood up at that first meeting?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely. "I remember thinking that the mayor was making a mistake and that you had numbers on your side. That was all." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember thinking that you were the most determined person I'd seen in a long time and that determination seemed worth hearing. Not," she said carefully, "that you were interested in me." He smiled at the grass. "I'm fairly sure I was interested in you before I finished that thought," he said. "But I was trying to be honest about my motivations, so I led with the numbers." She laughed. The evening light moved through the cottonwood leaves. Scout, who was a year old now and only somewhat less chaotic, was lying in the grass near the fence, apparently asleep. Clara's lamp was lit in her bedroom window. Henry was already asleep, a fact they knew because the particular small sounds he made when awake had gone quiet. "I'm glad you stood up," she said. "I'm glad you didn't sit," he said. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. They sat in the settling dark and listened to the creek and the grass, and the general quiet of an evening that asked nothing of them except to be present in it, which was the best kind of evening. 2 years later, Adelaide found herself once again with the familiar knowledge of a new life arriving. It announced itself in the same way, the tiredness, the particular morning awareness, and she spent a week with the knowledge before she told anyone, not out of uncertainty but out of pleasure. There was something she had discovered about holding good news privately for a time. It was its own form of abundance, the feeling of a thing known only to yourself before the world adjusted to accommodate it. She told Levi on the porch in the evening. This had become the place where the important things were said. He looked at her for a long moment with that particular stillness he had when something moved him deeply, and then he leaned forward and put both arms around her and held her close, and she put her face against his neck and breathed him in leather and sun and something particular to him alone, and they stayed like that while the evening deepened around them. "A third Donnelly," he said into her hair. "That is the plan," she confirmed. When they told Clara, who was now 11 and in possession of opinions so refined they could be applied to almost any situation, she said, without looking up from her book, "I already know." Adelaide looked at Levi. "How?" Clara turned a page. "You have had a look for 2 weeks, the same look as with Henry." She paused. "This time I would like a sister." "We'll see," Adelaide said. "I'm expressing a preference," Clara said. "I am aware I don't get a vote." She got her wish. The baby arrived in the following spring on a morning when the rain was coming down in long silver lines and the creak was loud enough to hear from the house. She was small and dark-haired and immediately in possession of a voice that suggested she had views about her situation. They named her Alina. Adelaide chose it, and it seemed to her exactly right, old and solid, and belonging entirely to the new small person it was given to. Clara held Alina with the authority of a girl who knew what she was doing, which she had acquired by being an excellent observer of everything and applying the lessons. Henry, 2 years old and in possession of an opinion about most things himself, was more cautious, approaching his sister with the careful diplomacy of someone encountering a fascinating and potentially unpredictable new development. "She's loud," he said. "You were loud," Levi told him. "I don't remember," Henry said. "Memory is funny that way," Levi agreed. The farm in the summer of 1885 was a different thing from the farm of 1878. It had accumulated 7 years of careful work and incremental improvements, a new roof on the main barn, an expanded kitchen garden, better fencing all around, and a water management system for the irrigation that Adelaide had designed over the course of 2 winters, and that Levi and Esteban had built together with a steadiness and skill that made her deeply proud of all of them. The southern branch of Harlan Creek still ran clean and sure and unimpeded, and on mornings when the light was right and the air was still, it made a sound like a long, satisfied exhale. Esteban had taken on a semi-retirement, coming in for the planting and harvest seasons, but spending more time in his own small house in town, and Diego had become the primary farmhand and showed signs of becoming the kind of man who would eventually have land of his own, which Adelaide intended to help him toward as much as she was able. She had helped him improve his English over the winters, and he had helped her improve her Spanish, and she considered that an excellent exchange. Levi's ranch was well established now, the herd healthy, the pastures in good condition, managed by a foreman he trusted. He spent most of his working days on the Winslow Donnelly farm, which was what they called it in the deed and in ordinary conversation, because it was both of theirs and always had been. On the anniversary of the town meeting, she kept track of it privately, not as a wound but as a marker. Adelaide walked down to the south pasture in the evening and stood where she and Levi had stood so many times, by the creek in the late summer light. She thought about the hall packed with people, the mayor's hand going up, the particular weight of being dismissed before you had finished speaking. She thought about the feeling of holding her ground and the trembling inside that nobody saw. And she thought about the sound of a chair scraping back, and a voice from the 4th row saying that it would like to hear more. She was standing there when she heard footsteps in the grass behind her, and she knew them before she turned, knew the weight and the pace, knew what they meant. Levi came to stand beside her. He had Alina on his shoulder, who was 11 months old now, and taking in the world with the large, considering gaze that Adelaide recognized as characteristic. Clara was somewhere behind them. She could hear the murmur of her talking to Henry, probably explaining something. They stood for a moment in the amber light with the creek running beside them. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at the water. "That day," she said, "that first meeting." He made a small sound of understanding. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. "I was thinking about everything that came from it, following it forward from that one point. Where does it lead?" She looked at him, at Alina on his shoulder, awake and watching the cottonwoods, at the sound of Clara's voice and Henry's behind them, at the farm around them, solid and worked and alive, and the creek secure in its banks. "Here," she said simply. He put his free arm around her and she leaned into him, and Alina reached over and grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair with the cheerful certainty of a person who knew where she belonged, and Adelaide laughed softly and did not move. The sun settled toward the hills. The creek ran on. Somewhere behind them, Clara was explaining something to Henry about the water table, with the authority of a girl who had grown up listening to her mother explain exactly that. and Henry was listening with the patient attention of a boy who trusted his sister even when her explanations were long. Scout appeared from the grass and pressed against Adelaide's legs, and she reached down and rubbed his ear, and he sighed with the contentment of animals who have found exactly the right place. This was what she had built, not out of ease and not out of luck, though luck had been part of it, the luck of standing up at the right moment and having the right person hear it, but mostly out of the willingness to stand, to hold her ground when she was told to yield, to know the value of her own voice and refuse to be silent even when the room was against her. She had raised her voice in a hot hall in the summer of 1878, and a man had stood up and said he wanted to hear more. And everything that had grown from that, this farm, this family, this long bright chain of ordinary extraordinary days, had grown from the fact that she had not sat down. She would tell Eleanor, when Eleanor was old enough to understand. She would tell her about the meeting and the papers and the numbers and the mayor's hand going up and the feeling of the room's weight and the choice not to yield to it. And she would tell her about the sound of a chair pushing back and the voice that said, "I would like to hear more." She would tell her that some moments are small and some are large, and the trick is that you often cannot tell the difference from inside them. You only know afterward, following the thread forward, discovering where one choice led and then another, until you are standing in a field in the evening light with everything you love around you, knowing that it all began somewhere specific, in some moment when you decided to stand. Adelaide Winslow, Adelaide Donnelly now, though she kept both names in the way of things that should not be entirely lost, stood by the creek in the last light of the summer day, held by her husband's arm, her youngest child regarding the world from his shoulder, her older children somewhere behind her discussing the water table, her dog satisfied at her feet. The creek ran. The light held as long as it could, and then the stars came out over the Texas panhandle, brilliant and indifferent and close, the same stars that had been there the night everything began, and Adelaide looked up at them and felt, with great clarity and no particular surprise, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.